I was sitting at the small oak table by the window, the one I've used for bills and letters since my 40s, when I noticed it. A single page lay heavier than the rest, its edges slightly curled, the paper thicker, more official. I held it longer than necessary, feeling its weight settle into my palm. The room was quiet in that late afternoon way, broken only by the clock on the wall, ticking with patience, at first. Nothing seemed wrong. Legal language, familiar phrases, my name typed neatly at the top. Then my eyes reached the signature line. I stared at it, waiting for recognition to arrive. It didn't. The name was mine, but the hand was not. The curve of the letters leaned too sharply, the final stroke rushed. I had signed my name the same way for over 60 years. This was not it. I didn't feel anger. Not yet. What rose instead was a thin, cold confusion, the kind that makes your stomach tighten before your mind catches up. I checked the page again, then the next. Power of attorney. Authority. Control. Words that had never belonged to anyone but me. I thought of my son, of family dinners and trust, of how I believed love made safeguards unnecessary. The clock kept ticking as settled in. Someone close to me had decided I was no longer capable. Worse still, they had acted as if I were already gone. I had lived a careful life long before any money ever entered the conversation. Mornings began early, not out of ambition but habit, with tea brewed strong and the newspaper folded the same way each day. My income was fixed, predictable, modest, but it had carried me through decades of work, child-rearing, and the quiet dignity of paying my own way. I believed deeply in not owing anyone explanations or favors. Everything I valued had been earned slowly, through showing up when it mattered and keeping promises even when no one was watching. My son grew up inside that rhythm. On the surface, he was dependable. He called when he said he would, fix things around the house, SPO. Cook confidently about the future. Friends admired his drive, and I did too, in measured ways. But beneath that reliability lived a restlessness I chose to interpret as ambition. He wanted more than steadiness. He wanted momentum. While I measured life in years and seasons, he measured it in outcomes. Family gatherings shifted almost without notice. Conversations that once centered on health, weather, or grandchildren began drifting toward efficiency. You shouldn't have to worry about this anymore, he'd say, glancing at paperwork. Or, let me handle it, you've earned a break. The words sounded kind, but they carried an assumption I hadn't agreed to. That management was better than autonomy. That age naturally surrendered authority. When the inheritance came, it arrived without ceremony. An estate settlement from a distant relative, finalized quietly, the figure precise and heavy with implication. $1.7 million. I didn't celebrate. I sat with the letter spread open on the same oak table and felt the weight of responsibility settle on my chest. Money, to me, was never freedom. It was obligation. It meant planning for medical care, insulating myself against becoming a burden, and ensuring that whatever remained would be divided fairly among my children. I told them as much. There would be no extravagance, no sudden change. The house would stay the same. My routines would stay the same. The money was not a prize. It was protection, a buffer against uncertainty, a way to finish life on my own terms. I believed that explanation would be enough, but explanations don't always land where we intend them to. I began to notice small shifts. Suggestions came faster. Concerns sounded sharper. Questions repeated themselves. The money sat quietly in its accounts, but it had found a voice in the room, one I hadn't invited. And slowly, almost politely, the balance of how I was seen began to change. It wasn't dramatic, just persistent. Phone calls about appointments I hadn't mentioned, reminders about things I had already handled. A sense that decisions were being discussed before I entered the room. I told myself it was concern, that families adapt, that children eventually worry about parents the way parents once worried about them. Still, something subtle had shifted its weight. Where my voice once ended conversations, it now paused them. The inheritance hadn't changed my life yet, but it had changed how others listened. I could feel it in the spaces between sentences, in the way help was offered before it was asked for. Money, I was learning, doesn't announce itself loudly. It whispers. And those whispers had begun to reshape the air around me, preparing the ground for something I did not yet understand but would soon be forced to face. At the time, I mistook that quiet pressure for care, not realizing how easily care can slide into control when trust goes unquestioned over time. The help began arriving wrapped in concern. My son called more often, his voice careful, rehearsed, as if each sentence had been weighed before it reached me. He spoke about markets, taxes, protections I should consider. He sent articles I hadn't asked for, links to legal services, suggestions that always ended with the same phrase, just in case. At first, I thanked him. It felt ungrateful not to. Children worry, that's the circle of things. Then the urgency crept in. Questions repeated themselves even after I'd answered them. Did you remember to pay that? Have you thought about what happens if you get sick? What if something happens suddenly? The words were gentle, but their rhythm was insistent. Each conversation carried an invisible clock, ticking faster than my own sense of time. I found myself explaining decisions I'd already made, defending competence I had never lost. I resisted the way I always had, politely and without confrontation. I smiled, deflected, reassured. I told myself this was love expressed awkwardly. A parent learns early that harmony summit. Ims costs silence, and I had spent a lifetime choosing peace over argument. Still, I felt a tightening when he spoke of forms and authority, of making things easier for everyone. Easier rarely means equal. The first rail crack appeared at the bank. A routine call turned strangely formal. The clerk asked if I'd submitted new authorization documents. I hadn't. She paused, then suggested I speak with their legal department. When the letter arrived days later, its language was cautious, almost apologetic. It referenced an attempted submission that did not align with existing records. No names were mentioned. Just dates, signatures, discrepancies. Emails followed. Automated notices from institutions I hadn't contacted. A voicemail from a legal office asking to confirm a request I'd never made. Individually, each message could have been a mistake. Together, they formed a pattern that pressed against my chest. I began laying the papers out on the table, side by side, aligning dates, reading lines twice. The same phrase appeared more than once: power of attorney. I didn't call my son. Not yet. I didn't raise my voice or demand explanations. Instead, I watched. I listened more carefully to what he said and what he avoided. I noted how often he asked where documents were kept, how quickly he volunteered to store copies for me. I recognized the precision in his concern. This was not panic. It was planning. What unsettled me most was the speed. Decisions were being pushed forward, appointments suggested before questions were settled. He spoke as if momentum itself was protection. As if waiting carried risk. It dawned on me, slowly and painfully, that time mattered to him in a way it did not to me. He was acting as though a door might close if he didn't reach it soon. I sat with that realization longer than I expected. The betrayal hurt, but the assumption hurt more. The belief that I would not notice. That I would comply out of fatigue or trust. I thought about the years I had spent. Teaching patience, restraint, the value of doing things properly. Somewhere along the way, urgency had replaced respect. Still, I did nothing outwardly. I kept my routines, answered calls, thanked him for his concern. Inside, however, something had shifted. Confusion hardened into clarity. I understood that reacting emotionally would only accelerate what was already in motion. If he was willing to move quietly, then so was I. Rather than confronting him, I chose to understand the full shape of what was unfolding. I needed to know how far it had gone, how much had been attempted, and how carefully it had been hidden. Only then could I decide what to protect, and how. That decision marked the end of innocence in our dynamic, and the beginning of vigilance, carried not with anger, but with resolve. I also reminded myself that knowledge, once gathered calmly, becomes a form of strength. Silence, in moments like this, was not weakness. It was preparation, a way to see clearly without tipping my hand too soon. Patience, I learned, can also defend. I did not tell my son when I decided to speak with a lawyer. The decision came quietly, without ceremony, the way most important choices in my life had been made. I scheduled the appointment myself and walked there alone, carrying a folder that felt heavier than it should have. Sitting across from a stranger, I spoke slowly, choosing facts over feelings, letting the story unfold in dates, documents, and signatures rather than hurt. The process was methodical. We traced timelines, compared handwriting, reviewed submission records. Each discovery confirmed what I had already begun to accept. The attempt had been real. The documents had been prepared carefully, presented confidently, and rejected only because a detail did not align. There was no misunderstanding, no clerical error to hide behind. Seeing it laid out so clearly stripped the situation of its ambiguity. Truth, once organized, leaves very little room for comfort. What surprised me was not the legal clarity, but the grief that followed it. I had expected anger to arrive first, loud and insistent. Instead, I felt something quieter and more exhausting. I mourned the version of my son I had carried for years, the one I believed shared my values simply because he had grown up under my roof. I replayed old conversations, searching for the moment I had misread him, wondering whether ambition had always been there, waiting for opportunity to sharpen it. I spent more time alone during those weeks. I walked familiar routes without destination, letting the rhythm of my steps settle my thoughts. Nights stretched longer, sleep broken by images I hadn't invited. I pulled out photo albums I hadn't opened in years, studying birthdays, school days, holidays frozen in forced smiles and genuine laughter. I asked myself whether love had blinded me or whether trust, once given, always feels foolish when it's betrayed. Despite the weight of it, I knew one thing clearly. I would not confront this emotionally. I would not argue, accuse, or plead for explanations that would only serve to protect pride. Whatever remained between my son and me would have to rest on truth, not persuasion. My response needed to match the seriousness of what had been attempted, and it needed to protect more than just money. It needed to protect my autonomy. Preparation became my focus. With guidance, I revised my estate planning carefully, line by line. Safeguards were added, authority clarified, contingencies spelled out with precision. Trusted witnesses were informed. Accounts were secured. Each step felt both necessary and sobering, like locking doors you never imagined would need keys. I did not feel satisfaction in doing this, only resolve. Throughout it all, I maintained the same outward routine. I answered calls, attended family meals, spoke kindly. Inside, I was no longer guessing. I was building a structure strong enough to hold what was coming. I understood then that truth does not always need confrontation to assert itself. Sometimes it needs space, preparation, and patience. I also came to understand something about myself during that quiet preparation. I was not defending money, I was defending the right to finish my life without being managed, rushed, or overridden. The inheritance had simply exposed a fracture that already existed, one I could no longer ignore. Each legal safeguard felt less like a barrier and more like a boundary I should have drawn years earlier. I stopped questioning whether I was being too harsh and started asking whether I was being honest. In that shift, a steadiness returned. I no longer felt reactive. I felt ready, not for conflict, but for clarity. I chose the moment carefully, not as a trap, but as an invitation to face what had been done. The setting mattered. Neutral ground. No raised voices. Just truth placed on the table, with no room left for assumptions or excuses to hide. Time would do enough. We met under ordinary pretenses, which was intentional. A quiet afternoon, coffee already poured, the table cleared of clutter the way it always was. I wanted the setting to feel familiar, almost disarming, so that nothing outside the truth itself would raise defenses too early. My son arrived on time, relaxed, confident. He spoke easily, asked about my health, commented on how well I looked. There was an ease to him that told me he believed the matter was already moving in his favor. I listened more than I spoke. When he finished, I told him I had invited someone to join us. The knock came gently, and when the door opened, the lawyer stepped in, polite, professional, carrying a slim folder. The shift in the room was immediate. My son's smile faltered, then reassembled itself into something cautious. I did not accuse him. I did not raise my voice. I simply said I wanted clarity. The documents were placed on the table one by one. Dates first. Then copies. Then the signature. The lawyer explained the sequence plainly, without emotion, as though describing a process rather than a betrayal. I watched my son's eyes move across the pages, watched him search for an opening that did not exist. He shook his head and laughed once, sharp and short, insisting there had been a mistake. He said my memory must be failing. He said he had only tried to help. As the explanation continued, denial gave way to irritation. He leaned back, crossed his arms, questioned technicalities. Why did this matter? Why make it legal? Didn't I trust him? Each question landed softly and slid away. The facts did not bend. The attempt had been made. The handwriting analyzed. The submission logged. Authority had been requested without consent. The room grew quieter as his defenses thinned. The confidence he'd arrived with drained slowly, replaced by something smaller. He stopped interrupting. His should. Airs slumped. I could see the moment when he realized there was no argument left that didn't expose him further. Control, which he had assumed was within reach, had moved entirely out of his hands. Throughout it all, I remained still. I did not enjoy this. I did not feel victorious. I felt steady. Authority had returned to its proper place, not through force, but through preparation. When the lawyer finished, I thanked him and asked him to wait outside. The silence that followed was heavier than any raised voice could have been. I looked at my son then, really looked at him, and spoke for the first time without restraint. I told him that what hurt most was not the paperwork, but the decision behind it. That he had not asked. That he had decided, on his own, that I would say no. My voice did not shake when I said it. You didn't ask, I told him, because you knew I would say no. He did not respond. His eyes dropped to the table, to the same surface where I had once helped him with homework, signed permission slips, trusted him without hesitation. I did not threaten him with consequences. I did not explain what would happen next. He already understood. The truth, once exposed, had sealed itself. The meeting ended quietly. No shouting. No dramatic exits. He gathered his coat, paused as if to speak, then thought better of it. The door closed behind him with a soft, final sound. The room felt larger after he left, emptier, as though something had been removed that could not be replaced. I sat there for a while longer, alone with the documents, with the certainty that whatever remained between us would now be shaped by honesty rather than assumption. I noticed how my hands rested flat on the table, steady, unafraid. Years ago, I would have rushed to explain, to soften, to protect his feelings over my own boundaries. Age had clarified what mattered. Respect could not be negotiated, and trust could not survive secrecy. This was never about money, but about seeing reality without illusion. When the lawyer returned briefly to confirm next steps, everything was already decided. There would be safeguards and distance where necessary. No spectacle, no public fallout. Just lines redrawn. After they left, the house returned to quiet. The clock ticked on. I gathered the papers and set them aside. The truth had spoken, and what followed would unfold without my interference. I remained seated for a moment longer, letting the stillness settle. The conversation was over, but its weight remained, filling the room with an honesty that could not be reversed or ignored again by anyone present. I did not pursue spectacle. The legal consequences were handled quietly, through letters, confirmations, and firm boundaries put in place. No police, no courtroom drama, no public humiliation. The law did what it was meant to do. It stopped what should never have begun. The days that followed felt strangely hollow. Conversations shortened. Phone calls went unanswered or were returned late, carefully. Family gatherings became cautious affairs, everyone measuring words, avoiding the obvious absence of ease. No one asked questions directly, but everyone adjusted, as if an invisible line had been redrawn and we were all learning where not to step. My son and I did not speak for some time. The silence was not dramatic, but it was deliberate. I could feel the space between us settle into something permanent, not hostile, just altered. Trust, I learned, does not vanish in an instant. It erodes, grain by grain, until what remains cannot carry weight. No inheritance, no apology, no passage of time can rebuild it exactly as it was. I did not feel victorious. There was no moment of relief where everything suddenly felt right again. What I felt instead was clarity. I had protected myself without cruelty, without turning anger into identity. That mattered to me more than punishment ever could. I had not allowed bitterness to decide who I became next. Life continued in smaller ways. I returned to my walks, to familiar routes and quiet mornings. I handled my affairs carefully, knowing now that vigilance was not mistrust, but self-respect earned late. I found comfort in the ordinary, in the absence of urgency, in the knowledge that my choices were once again my own. With distance came understanding. Not forgiveness yet, but acceptance of what had been revealed. I stopped asking myself how this could have happened and began asking how I wanted the story to end. That question mattered more than blame. Time passed, not dramatically, but steadily. In that passing, I realized the ending was still mine to write. Not with anger, not with public reckoning, but with intention. What was lost that day could not be recovered, but what remained could still be shaped with care. I would decide what carried forward, what stayed behind, and what kind of legacy would speak for me when words no longer could. I had learned that protecting oneself does not require hardening the heart. It requires honesty, boundaries, and the courage to accept reality without rewriting it to feel kinder. That lesson stayed with me, quiet but firm, as I stepped into the future on my own terms, aware of loss, but no longer defined by it. In choosing intention over resentment, I preserved something essential, a sense of dignity that could guide whatever years remained, and that choice felt like the truest form of resolution for me alone going forward. The final decisions came together slowly, with intention rather than urgency. I clarified my estate in ways that left no room for assumption. Boundaries were written plainly, not as punishment, but as protection. Authority was defined, responsibilities separated, and my wishes stated without apology. I felt no need to explain them beyond that. Clarity, once established, speaks for itself. Some of the money found new purpose. I redirected a portion toward causes that reflected the values I had lived by long before the inheritance existed. Education, so that opportunity would not depend entirely on luck. Care, so that dignity would not disappear when strength fades. Quiet support for people who needed stability more than attention. Giving in this way felt grounding, not generous, as though the money had finally been returned to something useful. My relationship with my son settled into something honest but limited. We spoke again, carefully, without pretending nothing had happened. I did not withdraw love, but I no longer offered access. Love, I learned, does not require control, and boundaries do not cancel affection. They simply define its shape. What trust remained was narrower, but it was real. My days grew calmer. I moved through them without the low hum of vigilance that had once followed me. I made decisions at my own pace, answered to myself, and slept more easily knowing there were no quiet negotiations happening without my consent. Life did not become extraordinary. It became steady, and steadiness felt like a luxury I had earned. Looking back, I see now that money does not corrupt or redeem on its own. It reveals. It sharpens what already exists. In my case, it exposed fault lines I had ignored and strengths I had underestimated. The inheritance tested everyone it touched, including me, and what endured was not wealth, but charactered. I no longer think of legacy as what is passed down intact. I think of it as what is demonstrated, repeated, and remembered. Integrity is not something you bequeath. It is something you practice until it becomes unmistakable. In choosing restraint over reaction, I discovered that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of alignment between who we are, what we protect, and how we choose to live afterward. I didn't lose my fortune that year. I learned what it was worth.